She posted one final message on Facebook on the night she died. 7 words. Raw, unfiltered, explosive. I've never hated someone as much as I hate someone now. Less than an hour later, Lucy Landry was fighting for her life in the dark, on a cold English country lane, outside a mansion that was supposed to be her fairy tale. She had been beaten with a granite rolling pin. She had been stabbed 23 times. She screamed loud enough for neighbours to hear her from across the estate. She ran. She banged on windows. She begged for someone to help her. And all of that, every last desperate, terrifying second of it, happened while her children slept inside that house. This is the story of Harold Landry, a self-made Louisiana oil millionaire, a man who built his fortune from the bayous of Louisiana, who reinvented himself as an English country gentleman, and who, behind closed doors, harboured a darkness that would eventually consume everything he claimed to love. This is the story of Lucy Davies, a Welsh musician, a mother, a woman who simply wanted her freedom back. And this is the story of what happens when a man with money, with rage, and with an iron belief that he could never be wrong, decides that if he can't have her, no one will. Love True Crime? The Ultimate Serial Killer colouring book features 65 notorious killers brought to life in bold black and white line art. Single-sided pages dark, detailed, unforgettable. Available now on Amazon. Harold grew up with roughly a dozen brothers and sisters in a large working-class Cajun family. No silver spoon, no connections, no shortcuts. What Harold had was ambition, a relentless drive, and the kind of hunger that only grows when you've had nothing. He made it out. Through the oil industry, specifically through the design of cranes for offshore oil platforms, Harold built himself into a millionaire. By the time he was establishing himself around Covington, Louisiana, he was a well-known employer, a man of substantial means, and a self-styled success story. He had also been married and divorced twice. He had 4 children in the United States, and by public accounts, he provided for them. Friends described him as generous, sociable, proud, and deeply attached to his family image. His former Louisiana lawyer and longtime friend Pat Fanning painted a more complicated picture. He described Harold as an angry guy, a man who was not easy to like, a man who, when he believed he was right, and Harold almost always believed he was right, was essentially immovable. That last detail matters more than almost anything else in this case. But in 1999, Harold was 53 years old. He had his money, he had his properties, and according to CBS, he was healthy, wealthy, and lonely. So he did what many lonely people of that era were beginning to do. He went online. Harold Landry's online handle was Cajun H. He was trolling internet chat rooms, the wild, unfiltered social media of the late 90s, and somewhere in that digital maze he found her. Her handle was Misery. She was Lucy Davies, 28 years old, a British music student, a Welsh woman living in England, a single mother raising a young son from a previous relationship. By all accounts, Lucy was extraordinary. Neighbours and friends would later describe her as bright, beautiful, and bursting with life. She had what one neighbour called an encyclopedic knowledge of classical music. She was gifted, she was warm, she was funny. She was also, in 1999, 25 years younger than the Louisiana millionaire on the other end of that chat room. The relationship moved fast. Harold travelled to the UK. The romance, as public reports would later describe it, blossomed quickly. Within a short time, Lucy became pregnant, and Harold, a man who had already built 2 families, who was now staring down the back half of his 50s, saw in Lucy something he desperately wanted: a second life, a new chapter, a completely different version of himself. They married. Lucy and her young son moved into a world of financial security that she had never known before, and Harold, for his part, made one of the most revealing decisions of this entire story. He moved to England. He didn't bring Lucy back to Louisiana. He left everything behind: his bayou roots, his oil empire, his friends, his community, and he followed Lucy to the English countryside. He wanted to reinvent himself: a Cajun millionaire, an English country gentleman, a new man in a new world. In 2002, Pat Fanning, Harold's old Louisiana lawyer, met the couple while they were vacationing in Mexico. Lucy was vivid, attractive, and clearly the centre of Harold's world. Harold, by Fanning's account, doted on her. He gave her everything: the holidays, the lifestyle, the prestige. He was in those early years completely captivated. The couple settled on the Besford Court estate near Pershore, Worcestershire, a prestigious high-end development built around a Tudor manor. Their home was a large, imposing Cotswold-style house. Their daughter Harriet was born. Lucy's son James grew up under their roof. From the outside, it looked like the life Harold had always wanted. From the outside. Here is the thing about Harold Landry that the glossy photographs and the country estate and the holidays in Mexico could never quite cover up. Harold was a man who needed to win, who needed to be right, who needed to feel in control of the world around him, and particularly of the people around him. Friends told CBS that after a few years of marriage, the relationship showed signs of becoming, in their words, a volatile mixture of anger and alcohol. Arguments became more frequent, more intense, more dangerous. And when Harold drank, the version of Harold that emerged was not the generous, sociable man who liked to tell stories about Louisiana. It was something harder, something colder. What nobody in Pershore knew, what Harold had never disclosed to his English neighbours or his new English life, was that this was not the first time Harold's temper had crossed a critical line. Go back, way back, to February 6th, 1994. 16 years before Lucy's death, Harold Landry was involved with a woman in Louisiana. That woman had a husband. His name was Chris Price. And one day, Chris Price tracked Harold down, found him at a traffic light, and got out of his car to confront him. What happened next was witnessed by a young woman named Kristen Harton. According to her account, Harold Landry pointed a .38 caliber handgun out of his car window. He said, out loud, clearly in front of witnesses, "I'm going to shoot you." And then he did. Chris Price was shot in the neck. He survived, but barely. Harold was arrested for attempted murder. His defence argued self-defence. Never mind that it happened in broad daylight. Never mind that there were witnesses. Never mind that it happened right outside a hospital. Harold's defence, Harold's absolute unwavering conviction that he was the real victim in any situation, got the charge reduced to aggravated battery. He was convicted in October 1994, and after appeals he walked away with probation, a $500 fine, and community service. He never went to prison. He moved on. He went online. He met Lucy. And nobody in England knew any of this. By approximately 2009, roughly 10 years into the relationship, the marriage had fallen apart completely. Lucy had done something that would have been unimaginable to Harold. She had started looking for a way out. She had reconnected with a former school friend through Facebook, and that reconnection had become something more. She wanted a divorce. She wanted her freedom. She wanted to take her children and start over. Harold's response to this was, by every account, catastrophic. Friends said he was in a terrible state. A man like Harold, a man who had rebuilt his entire identity around this marriage, around this English life, around this woman, could not process the idea of losing her. And more than losing her emotionally, he could not accept losing her financially. He told a neighbour he did not want Lucy to benefit from the divorce. He changed his will. By August 2009, the separation was underway. Both were still living under the same roof but in separate bedrooms, an arrangement that must have felt like a slow, daily humiliation for a man like Harold. By then, both had formed new relationships, Lucy with her school friend, Harold with a woman who lived nearby. The divorce negotiations were brutal. Lucy demanded money for an apartment. Harold agreed, and then watched as Lucy used those funds to hire a powerful divorce lawyer. The arguments over money, over property, over furniture, over who would get what and who would walk away with how much became consuming. Prosecutors would later say Harold was trying to prevent Lucy from taking anything of substance. He believed she didn't deserve it. Late 2009 turned into early 2010, and the tension inside that house, that beautiful, expensive house on the Besford Court estate, reached a breaking point. Monday, February 1st, 2010. It began like many of the recent days in that house had begun, with resentment, with proximity, with the ticking clock of a marriage that was already dead but had not yet been buried. Somewhere during that day, Lucy Davies, a woman who had spent months fighting to reclaim her life, who was navigating a legal battle, who was trying to protect herself and her children, went to her Facebook page. She typed out 7 words. "I've never hated someone as much as I hate someone now." She posted it. And less than an hour later, the final argument began. Court reporting and Landry's own account described the fight starting inside the house. It was about the divorce. It was about furniture. Specific pieces of furniture Lucy wanted when she finally moved out. At some point, the argument moved into Lucy's bedroom, where Harold grabbed for her phone. At some point, it spilled into the kitchen. What happened in that kitchen is the heart of Landry's defence, a defence the jury and the judge would ultimately tear apart. Harold claimed that in the kitchen Lucy shoved him, that he stumbled into a baker's rack, that he grabbed what was closest to hand, a granite rolling pin, and threw it at her, striking her in the head. He also claimed, crucially, that Lucy had picked up a knife first, that she had threatened him, that he was acting in self-defence or at the very least in a blind panic of provocation. The judge would later say that claim had all the hallmarks of a story invented after the fact. Because what happened next was not the chaotic, desperate act of a man overwhelmed by fear. What happened next was a chase. Lucy ran. Bleeding, staggering, already seriously injured from the rolling pin, she got out of that house and into the dark English night. She ran toward a neighbour's house. She screamed. She banged on windows. She begged for someone to open a door. Neighbours heard her. One went outside. They found her near a hedge by the driveway. But Harold had followed her outside. He stabbed Lucy Landry 23 times. 23. The sentencing judge would later note that many of those wounds were inflicted while Lucy was already on the ground, while she was trying to cover herself, trying to protect her body, trying to survive. She had a major facial wound. By the time first responders arrived, there was still a large butcher's knife in her body. She was rushed to Worcestershire Royal Hospital. She did not survive. Inside the house, in the backyard, police found 2 children, Harriet, 7 years old, James, 14 years old. They had been inside that house all night. They did not yet know their mother was dying at the front of the property. West Mercia police were called at 11:45 p.m. on February 1st, 2010. Harold Landry was found by a police sergeant shortly before midnight, walking alone on a dark country lane. He was compliant. He showed little outward emotion. Officers said he seemed calm. But before he started walking, Harold had made one stop. He had driven to the cottage of his new partner, the woman he had been seeing while the divorce dragged on. He knocked on her door and told her that something awful had happened. Then he handed her 3 bankers' drafts totalling £30,000, a bundle of cash, his car keys, and signed blank cheques. And then he walked away into the dark. He was arrested just before midnight. He was charged with murder on February 4th, 2010. For roughly a year, the case moved through the British court system. In February 2011, Harold Landry stood trial at Wolverhampton Crown Court. The jury heard 7 days of evidence. There were, remarkably, no courtroom objections from either side throughout the proceeding. The prosecution, led by Rachel Brand QC, laid out a clear and devastating case. Harold had changed his will. He had told neighbours he didn't want Lucy to benefit financially. He had formed a new relationship but refused to let his marriage end on terms that didn't suit him. He had attacked Lucy with a granite rolling pin and then followed her outside and stabbed her 23 times in the dark. The prosecution used a courtroom animation to show the jury the sequence and the scale of the attack. The violence of what had been done to Lucy, the relentlessness of it, was impossible to dismiss as a momentary breakdown. The defence accepted that Harold killed Lucy. They had to. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they argued manslaughter by provocation, that Lucy had humiliated Harold for months, that she had pushed him in the kitchen, that she had picked up the knife first, that an ordinary person in his position might have snapped. Harold himself took the stand the day before his 65th birthday. He cried. He said he loved Lucy. He said he could not remember the stabbing itself. He described months of humiliation and emotional torment. He was, in his own telling, once again the real victim. The jury took 3 hours and 52 minutes to convict him of murder. After the verdict, the jury was told what nobody in England had known during the trial. Harold Landry had been convicted of aggravated battery in Louisiana in October 1994 after shooting a man in the neck in front of witnesses. The judge, Mr. Justice Foskett, sentenced Harold Landry to life imprisonment on February 25, 2011, with a minimum term of 16 years. In his sentencing remarks, he said the attack on Lucy was unspeakable and unforgivable. He said he had no doubt Harold had intended to kill her. And he said this, the line that cuts through everything. There is a trait within you that, if provoked and challenged, can lead to serious violence. Technical analysis of the case. From a legal and forensic standpoint, the Harold Landry case is a textbook example of how domestic homicide prosecutions succeed when physical evidence, behavioural patterns, and the elimination of alternative narratives all converge. The defence's central argument, provocation leading to manslaughter, required the jury to accept 2 things simultaneously. First, that Lucy had threatened Harold with a knife, and second, that his response was proportionate to the threat he perceived, or at least understandable to an ordinary person. The prosecution dismantled both pillars. On the knife claim, the judge found it implausible on its face. A man who claims to have grabbed a rolling pin in panic and thrown it impulsively does not then chase his victim outside into the dark and deliver 23 stab wounds while she is on the ground. That sequencing alone destroys the provocation narrative. Provocation implies a sudden, momentary loss of control. What the physical evidence described was a sustained, lethal assault that continued long after any conceivable moment of snapping. The prosecution's use of a courtroom animation was significant from an evidentiary strategy standpoint. Rather than asking jurors to imagine the attack through testimony alone, it visualized the sequence and spatial reality of what happened, where Lucy moved, where Harold followed, the geography of violence in the dark outside the estate. This technique is increasingly common in serious violence prosecutions and is particularly effective when the defense relies on cognitive framing. I don't remember, / it was a blur. Landry's post-crime behaviour was also central to disproving provocation. His immediate movement to his partner's cottage, the transfer of £30,000 in bankers' drafts, the signed blank cheques. This is not the behaviour of a man in shock who has just lost control. It is the behaviour of someone who understood exactly what he had done and was attempting to manage consequences. The decision to withhold Landry's 1994 Louisiana conviction from the jury until after the verdict is standard practice in English criminal law. Prior convictions are generally excluded from the guilt phase to prevent prejudice. But the fact that jurors were told immediately after convicting him underscores the structural parallel between the 2 episodes. A man who responded to relational conflict with serious targeted violence framed himself as the victim both times, and relied on the same defence logic across 16 years. The 16-year minimum term, while substantial for England and Wales, reflects both the severity of the killing and the court's assessment of Landry's risk profile. Psychological analysis. The psychological profile that emerges from the public record of this case is consistent and, in retrospect, deeply alarming. Harold Landry fits a well-documented pattern in domestic homicide research. The controlling partner who uses financial dominance, emotional intensity, and a constructed relationship identity to bind their partner to them, and who responds to the collapse of that control with escalating aggression. Several behavioural markers appear across the timeline. First, there is the consistent self-exculpatory narrative. After shooting Chris Price in 1994, Harold believed he was right. After stabbing Lucy in 2010, Harold cried on the stand and said he loved her, while maintaining that she had threatened him first. In both instances, the framework is identical. Harold as wronged party, Harold as the real victim, Harold as a man pushed beyond endurance by forces outside his control. This unwillingness or inability to accept personal responsibility, even when caught, even when convicted, is a hallmark of certain personality structures where the self-concept is fundamentally organised around dominance and justified action. Second, there is the age gap and financial control dynamic. Harold was 25 years older than Lucy. He provided everything: the home, the lifestyle, the stability. That financial disparity created a structural imbalance that likely made it very difficult for Lucy to leave cleanly, quickly, or safely. When she did try to leave, Harold's immediate responses, changing his will, refusing to give her fair financial terms, trying to minimise what she would receive, were not just practical negotiations. They were attempts to maintain control over someone who had decided she no longer wanted to be controlled. Third, there is the phenomenon sometimes described as separation-triggered escalation. Research consistently shows that the period immediately after a partner announces their intention to leave is the most dangerous phase of an abusive relationship. The controlling partner's behaviour often intensifies dramatically when faced with the loss of control that separation represents. The final months of the Landry marriage, the separate bedrooms, the ongoing financial battle, the acrimony, the final argument, unfold almost exactly along this documented pattern. Finally, Harold's crying on the stand and his claim that he could not remember the stabbing deserves scrutiny. Dissociative memory gaps claimed in the wake of extreme violence may sometimes be genuine, but in the context of a man who had already framed himself as the victim, who had transferred £30,000 within minutes of the killing, and whose entire defence depended on Lucy being the aggressor, the tears and the memory gap function as rhetorical tools as much as emotional facts. The judge saw through it, the jury saw through it, and the pattern, the Louisiana shooting, the English marriage, the violent finale, forms a coherent and chilling portrait of a man who believed, at a fundamental level, that the rules that governed other people's behaviour did not apply to him. That is the story of Harold Landry and the murder of Lucy Landry. If this case reached you, if it stayed with you, please share it. Leave a comment below telling me which part of this story hit hardest. And if you want more cases like this one, British crimes, American crimes, international crimes that the mainstream won't touch, subscribe to this channel. We're here every week. Lucy Davies, remembered. We'll see you in the next one.